Okay, Chris Darrow, Claremont, California. And, okay, so Chris, yeah, tell me about the music scene around here back in the late 50s, early 60s, and when Zappa was around these parts.
Well, the music scene here was, during the late 50s and early 60s, I was playing a lot of bluegrass and was playing at Disneyland and playing at the local clubs around, one called the Meeting Place around here, one in LA, eventually called, I played at the Ash Grove, the Ice House in Pasadena. And most of us that were playing music most of the people I knew were playing folk music. The West Coast was kind of, West and the East Coast guys my age were kind of, I graduated from high school in 1962, so from like 59 to 64 I was pretty much playing bluegrass music, and in 64 I started playing, I formed a band called the Flogs after I heard the Beatles, and a lot of us that had been, because the early 60s, the music on the radio, those of us who had grown up in the 50s were all into Elvis and Buddy Holly and the Crickets and Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran and those guys, and so I had all their records. But the music of our particular period, there wasn't, in the early 60s, it was basically Fabian and Frankie Avalon, and at least either Buddy Holly had died, and Richie Valens had died, and Elvis was in the Army, and so we were all playing, most of us that were actually any good at playing musicians, guys like Chris Hillman and Jerry Garcia, who was up north, and a lot of us guys, we all were playing folk music, and primarily bluegrass. So guys like Frank, who was an anathema, and he was also a little bit older than the rest of us. He's a few years older than me. I had gone to school with Bobby Zappa, his brother at Claremont High. He was 1 year ahead of me at Claremont. So I knew Frank basically through him, sort of, and Dick Barber, who became his road manager, was a guy that when I first moved to Claremont in 1948 with my parents at the age of 4, the first guy I met was a guy around the corner whose name was Dick Barber, and he was a year ahead of me, and so he and Bobby were good friends, and so there's this weird sort of connection that happened with that. Now, much later on, my friend Ed Beardsley, who apparently was Frank's really good friend at Chaffey College and stuff, we became friends when I went to Mount San Antonio College after I graduated from high school. There was a little place over out on Foothill Boulevard is Route 66, and it runs about, I don't know, eighth of a mile from my house, and I've always lived, and when I've lived in Claremont, I've always lived within about a mile of Route 66, and so it's our major East Coast roadway here in town, and so Foothill Boulevard, which runs east and west, right on the other outside of town. The town originally was a no drinking town. It was a dry city. It was, and I had my early bluegrass band was called the Reorganized Dry City Players. So just east of town there was this unincorporated area that had where the bars were, and so if you wanted to go drink or go get a beer, you had to go out to you had to drive east, and you had to get on Route 66, and you went about, from my house it's about a quarter of a mile right now, but in those days it was a little farther, but not much, and there were these places out there, and there was a lot of these, I think Frank became kind of a legend in his own time. You knew that he wanted to be famous. That was a thing about him. He wanted to be famous, and he wanted to do something, and you didn't know much about what was going to happen with him. And so as far as the music went in the area, for instance, there was this club called the Meeting Place out on Foothill that was a folk club that I frequented quite regularly, and my band, the Reorganized Dry City Players, played out there, and there was a lot of, which we'll talk about later, but on Thursday nights they had a what they called a hoot night or a hootenanny night. Now it would be open mic. They would call it an open mic or something like that, and people from all over the area would come and play. And most of the and it was and the Meeting Place was at nights, was when it was open. It was in the daytime it was a swim club, And so it wasn't, so they'd have a stage set up and a PA and folding chairs that were, for the city and the audience. And on every Thursday, we'd go out and play because that was another place. It was a good place to play. So we'd go out there on Thursday nights, and our band would show up, and whoever was in the area, and folk musicians and bluegrass bands and folk bands and stuff. So this kind of maverick kind of personality that he had, I think some of it was for show. And obviously he was a maverick. He had his own ideas about the way things were supposed to be, and I think that was probably one of the reasons that when he started the Mothers, that was, knowing the guys that became part of the Mothers during all those years, they were all kind of outsiders like he was. He didn't pick a bunch of guys that were good-looking guys who looked good on camera and stuff. He was into the way they played and how they performed and where they came from. And the early Mothers were basically a lot of local musicians that were from around here in the first place.
Yeah, Ray and...
Well, Ray was basically Ray's band, as I understand,
Right.
from the beginning, and
pretty much.
to some degree, Ray felt that Frank usurped it from
Right.
him, and I don't know whether that's the truth or not, but I think there's probably some, some gray area in there someplace.
But yeah, no, I have researched all this. I know, the whole bust at his recording studio. Yeah, that's well documented. But at the same time, I've heard that he'd been arrested once or twice. One of them was when he was up in before he moved here, when he was like in high school, and he played in a mixed racial band up there in the desert in Lancaster.
Yeah.
And so they did not want them to make some performance that they were going to perform somewhere. So the cops ended up grabbing Frank and arresting him for vagrancy or something and locking him up just so they can keep him from giving this performance. So yeah, I was just asking about that. Is this one that I hadn't heard of before or something? But anyway, so now did you jam with Frank a lot or play same venues or?
Well, when I was in the Kaleidoscope back in the '60s, we did some gigs together. Hullabaloo being one place, and one of the best stories I can tell. I have a couple of great stories I can tell, but I'll start you with this one. And this was when I was in the Kaleidoscope. We had done 2 albums for Epic Records. I decided that I wanted to go my own way, and with our first 2 albums are the ones that are now they have all been re-released and on some major labels, and a company in England now has a 3 CD set out of all the Kaleidoscope stuff that was on Epic. There was 3 albums on the first 2, and I left the band for my own kind of personal reasons, that I wanted to kind of explore different music, and the band had started as a leaderless band, and then their faction started up, and I decided, well, I'm going to go my own way. But the guy that was going to take my place couldn't join right away, and I got a call from one of the members and saying, well, we have this gig in New York, and would you be interested in going to New York and playing some of the East Coast stuff before he joins? He was actually working with Jeff and Maria Moldar, and he couldn't get out of that until he had fulfilled their obligation to them. So I said sure. So I decided to fly back there. They were going to drive 2 Volkswagen vans, and since I was out of the band, I felt it was easier for me to do it that way. So I flew back, and we were playing at first gig we were hired to play at. It was a place called The Scene, which was down on 46th Street, and the guy Steve Paul, and that was one of the hottest clubs in New York City, and we had never been to the East Coast. And at that time, this was '67. This was peace and love time in the West Coast, and hippies, and we were all long-haired and bearded and mustached and Levi'd and flanneled, and New York hadn't really gotten there yet. And so as I told you before, my friend Dick Barber ended up becoming the road manager for the Mothers, and by that time there was some interaction between the mothers, and I'd seen them, and I knew who they were and what they were doing. And so when we get to New York, the band got a place to stay at a place called the Albert Hotel, which was down in the Village, and it was the place where everybody, well, from the West Coast, we always heard that was this place where all the musicians stayed, and so we thought, well, let's get a place, and it was basically a shitty place, and it was, and we got, because we didn't have a lot of money, our managers put us up there, but we shared a couple of rooms, and there was, I don't know how many of us there, my friend Solomon and his girlfriend and the managers, and we all stuff like that. And I remember the first day I get up and okay, I'm going to go out see New York for the first time. We'd gotten there late in the day, and in fact, it was one of those things where some of our instruments got stolen because nobody ever. We didn't know about New York, and they didn't leave somebody by the car, and the Volkswagen was open, and my Telecaster got stolen, and a couple of other instruments got stolen. So that started off the tour kind of badly. So I said, okay, well, I've never been to New York here. It's in wintertime in December, and I get up and I walk out, and I'm standing on the corner of where the Albert was on the corner, and I was standing out looking around and kind of saying, well, I guess here it is. What do I do? All of a sudden I hear, Chris! I look over, and it's this guy walking across the street. He's got a full-length mink coat on. He's got hair down to here, big mustache, and it was Frank Zappa. He said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm here playing at the scene with the Kaleidoscope. And he said, well, I said, what are you doing here? He said, oh, that's where we're living here now. We got a rehearsal hall down the street. I said, come on down. So my first out the door in New York, I run into Frank, and we go down, and then we start hanging out, and it was there. And I said, well, why don't you come up and see us play? We're going to play tonight. So we open tonight. So we were opening for Nico of the Velvet Underground, and I had known her in L.A. a little bit because she was the guy that was our producer, Barry Friedman, who later produced a number of other people, including the Holy Modal Rounders and stuff like that. Nico, and when she was hanging out with Jim Morrison, they were at the house, so I met Nico when she was in L.A., and so I knew her a little bit, and I didn't even know that's who was going to open for us. So we get there, and Nico at that time was playing Hammond B3 organ and singing alone, and then us being a sort of a psychedelic West Coast band, first time in the East Coast, it was total like black and white. And the first night, Andy Warhol was there with Edie Sedgwick, and the band was the house band was run by the guy from the McCoys, and Rick Derringer was the house band guy, and Tiny Tim was the sort of the greeter, and it was heavy. I mean, and the guy that owned the place, he managed a lot of people like the Chambers Brothers and a number of. So it was a heavy thing. And that night, this guy came up to me and he said, "Well, I'm doing this record," and he was this guy with the palest guy I'd ever seen in my life, carrying a briefcase and dark hair, and said, "I'm doing a record." And of all the people that I'd ever seen in my life, he didn't look like a guy that was doing a record. Even most of the guys that were musicians at least looked like somebody you'd expect to be a musician. Now, like on the East Coast, there was some guys with long hair and stuff, but most of the guys that were the East Coast musicians looked kind of like they had the shorter hair, and they were they were stylish and all that kind of stuff. But the West Coast and the East Coast was really separated at that time. And this guy had no idea who it was, and he came up and said, "Well, we're working on this record. Would you be interested in working on this record?" And I said, "Well, talk to those guys. Those are our managers over there." So he went and talked, and it was Leonard Cohen. So next day, we were up in his apartment working out songs and stuff. And apparently, he had 3 different producers, and he was having trouble. And he told me, and told us at the time, he said, "I'm just, he needed somebody, because he wasn't a real good guitar player, but he had written these songs, and a lot of people, I guess people were having a hard time trying to figure out what to do. So eventually, a couple days later, we were in the studio working. I played bass, and David Lindley played some guitar, and Max Buda, who was Chester Krill in the Kaleidoscope, played some harmonica, and turned out to be the first Leonard Cohen record. And they didn't cite any players on that on the album covers, so a lot of people didn't know that for a long time. And so I played on the first Leonard Cohen record, and that was one of my first sessions I ever did in my life for anybody. So that was so later in the week, the Scene, which was an underground club, it was down one step from the street. Was pretty safe there, but somehow or other, when we were not there at the club, our instruments were all locked in this wine cage with double locks and all this kind of stuff, and it was downstairs. And we came in one day, and we actually got called and found out that somebody had broken it somehow or other. They come down through the main air shaft and into the middle of that cage, and had broken through the brick wall and stolen a bunch of our stuff, including some of our amps and some of our drums. And apparently they had found the guy eventually. He was a heroin addict, and they found some of the stuff. But it took a few days to get some of it back. Some of it had already been sold. And to make a long story short, Frank and the Mothers loaned us a bunch of stuff so we could continue playing there. They loaned us some amps and everything. So aside from being friends and everything, they really helped us out. And it was an interesting kind of East Coast versus West Coast situation. And it was strange because we were supposed to play at the Cafe A Go-Go next after the Scene. And the week we were there at the Scene, the Cafe A Go-Go had Mike Bloomfield band, and the Moby Grape were there. Mm-hmm. So somebody from the Cafe A Go-Go came to see us play, and they didn't like us very much. So consequently, we lost our gig.
That was with Kaleidoscope?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we ended up playing somewhere else, and we ended up playing some other gigs there. And we opened for The Difference in Airplane was in New York. I think at the New York, what are the colleges out of New York? That's out in Long Island. Anyway, but so we ended up playing there, and we did some concerts up in Boston before I left. I ended up leaving the band, right. But I ended up joining the Dirt Band. They were looking for somebody, and they found out I had left the band, and so I went back there without a job, and I came back to L.A. with a new band. So
with Nitty Gritty Dirt Band.
Yeah, that's what happened. So I was glad I went on that trip.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Now, Frank and Ray Collins, they had a kind of a comedy folk duo. They went by different names, the Sin City Boys and Loeb and Leopold, but it was, from what I understand, it was like a kind of like they would spoof the traditional folk songs. Mm-hmm. They'd sing Puff the Magic Dragon and change the words around. It'd be, Griff the Sleazy Beatnik or whatever. And so I was just wondering when Frank did that thing at the meeting place, if that might have been some kind of a. But so he was just there by himself, though. He was
out by himself, right. And he did everything straight faced. And you would, to be quite honest with you, I don't remember what the song was, but it sounded like something that was totally not. I don't remember it being a parody of anything.
Right. Okay.
And I don't know whether that was before or during or after. Right, to be quite honest with you.
Right. Now, do you remember seeing Frank performing around any other places around here?
Not at that particular time
right.
frame. I saw him much later, and when I was working with Linda Ronstadt, it was when he was living in the house over in the old Tom Mix house in L.A. down there. I mean, I would visit him there and hang out, and I used to see him in the office a lot. And no, most of, like I said, most of the stuff that were in my performances around here were at the folk clubs and and by the time David Lindley and Steve Cahill and I had a band called it evolved from we had two bands. David and I had two bands, and then we merged the two bands into one band, and then eventually came the Dry City Scat Band, which was one of the best bluegrass bands in California at the time. And so we used to play, and we played at Disneyland for a couple of years, and we played, like I said, we played at the Ash Grove and opened for people like Mance Lipscomb and Lightnin' Hopkins and Mississippi John Hurt, and so that was, and so my playing days post high school up till the time that I started playing electric music, most of it was folk venues, and they were quite good ones, but so in terms of hanging out at any of the rock venues around or seeing, because like the Troubadour, for instance, I mean, Frank wouldn't have played at the Troubadour either, so I played there a lot, with all kinds of people from Kaleidoscope to the Dirt Band, John Stewart to Hoyt Axton, all those people.
I was trying to get in touch with Dick Barber, and last I heard he was operating a dirt truck out in Nevada or something.
Baker, I think.
Huh?
Baker, California is when I heard it
In
was.
Baker?
That's where he lived. He moved. He kind of disappeared. I don't know. There's a guy here in a friend of mine, and he used to have a restaurant in Claremont downtown.
Right,
Square
One.
One.
Right.
And his partner was a guy named Charles Zetterberg, who was an attorney in Claremont, who was, when I was actually in New York with the Kaleidoscope, he was also a bluegrass banjo player, a friend of mine. He was also in the same class as Barber, a year ahead of me. Great basketball player and tennis player, and he was going to Columbia Law School when I was in New York, so I ended up staying at his house for most of the time up there. I mean, he and I shared. There was an apartment. They had a bunch of guys that lived in an apartment, and I took a little. It actually was They had a little spare room that was actually an old closet, and that's where I stayed up there. So he might know how to get a hold of Barber. I don't know anybody that I mean, all of a sudden he just sort of disappeared, and I don't know where he is.
Yeah, first I heard he was out in Arizona, and then I heard he was in Nevada, and then I heard that he was running some kind of a dirt moving truck. He had some kind of little, private business or something. That he
Well,
was doing.
I heard that he was somebody. I don't know who told me. It might have been George Goad, but it was somebody that told me that he was driving these big heavy equipment things with tires that's big and stuff. It wasn't a little truck. I mean, and he was always a car guy. I mean, when he was one of those guys that when we were in high school, he had this old Plymouth station wagon that looked like, we used to call it the Gray Ghost, and it was it was all souped up, but he wouldn't own it. And then he had this, I forget what car it was. It was I think either a 55 Ford or 54 Chevy or something like that. That looked just stock and everything like that, and it was just beefed up under the hood. And so he was into cars and into things. So it doesn't surprise me. And he was for one of the first times I ever got. Dick claims that I took him to his first rock concert. I don't know what it was, and he used to live up in the groves up here. The last time I saw any of the Mothers all at one time was actually up at Dick Barber's place when he was living up in the groves, and there was a big party up there. Frank wasn't there, but Elliot and all these other guys were there, and Artie Tripp, and I have some pictures of me playing along with those guys. And George goes there. He plays some congas, and the Turtle guys were there. And so anyway, but as far as only time I ever really coexisted musically in the same room playing music with those guys was up at that party. But I knew a lot of those guys, and like I said, I'd run into them, I'd see them, and I always loved the Mothers. I thought they were great, and I know my friend Kim Foley was on the first record. My friend Denny Bruce played in the early Mothers for a short while as one of the drummers. He wasn't very long, but do you know Denny Bruce's name?
I've heard him, yeah.
Well, Denny produced the Fabulous Thunderbirds and Leo Kottke and John Fahey, and he was head of Tacoma Records for a long time, and he was a really dear friend, still a dear friend of mine, and he produced a lot of stuff, so you know, a lot of people pass through Frank. Frank was you know, one of the things that I know about Frank is that it was what you did and how you did it, not whether or not you were good looking or whether or not you were some kind of, you know, star type quality. In fact, and there, you know, and some of the people in the bands, you will find that, you know, were kind of left wing psychologically as well as musically, and Barber, I mean, one of the reasons that, you know, Barber was a football player. He was kind of a big guy. He was the one that collected the money, and I think that one of the reasons that they had somebody like that doing that is that he needed somebody Frank needed somebody on the crew that could handle the band as well, who was you know, had some kind of stature and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I always thought that Frank was you know, it was like guys like Duke Ellington and guys like Springsteen and these guys, they get a team together, they keep the team together, and it's not an easy thing to do, and especially if you're moving forward with your music, sometimes you got to let go of certain people because some people don't follow the next situation. And I think so a lot of the stuff that maybe Frank gets bad rap for has to do with the fact that a lot of people don't take his situation into consideration. It comes from the other side. So
yeah, basically as his music progressed, if his current musicians couldn't play his new music, he'd bring in somebody who could, you know.
That's right.
So, anyway, well, I appreciate that. Anything else that sticks out that you want to mention that we haven't covered?
Well,
any kind of influence?
Going to his house when he was living in Tom Mix's house was an interesting experience because it was obviously a interesting place, but you know, it was like it was just a regular. I mean, you go inside and there was kids running around, and the wife was in the kitchen, and they're making coffee, and there was things going on, and it wasn't this kind of crazy, weird thing that a lot of people expected from him. He just, you know, he lived a real normal life, and he had the studio downstairs, and then he'd go downstairs and he'd hang out down there, and people were coming in and out all the time, and it was a real active situation. And I think that like I want to say is that my greatest remembrance of Frank was the fact that he was a nice guy. I never had any problems with him. I was always very, he was, like I said, he helped us out a bunch of different times. When I'd see him, he was always happy to see me. I didn't feel that there was, and I had a great deal of respect for his abilities and what he was doing. And I didn't always agree with him musically. Sometimes I feel that's pretty far out or something, but that doesn't have anything to do with it. You know, it's his business. And the fact that, you know, I had met, when I was at the Kaleidoscope, I met Vince, who became Alice Cooper. His band, the Spiders, opened for us when I was at the Kaleidoscope back, and so I got to know him back in the old days. And then when they moved out to L.A., they had a band. We used to play at the Cheetah, and I used to, you know, run into him, and so the fact that he understood what the, you know, those guys were trying to do. I mean, he had, you know, his label, you know, Wildman Fisher, GTOs, you know,
Captain Beefheart,
who I remember him too. I saw him play a couple of times. A guy named Victor Mortensen that I went to school with out here. He was one of the early. I heard about him really early on. I heard about Beefheart early on because he was a drummer from Claremont that I'm playing with this guy named Captain Beefheart, and it's a name you don't forget, you know, and so part of that whole, you know, so there was this I don't know if I want to use the word avant-garde, but that's probably as good a term as any to say that Frank was, was an avant-garde guy, and he wanted to be, and he strove to be that person, and it was a shame that he passed away the way he did, because, I'm sure he would still be making great music if he was alive today, So, I would say that's probably it as far as all the significant stuff I could tell you about.
Sure.
At this point.
And then of course Terry Kirkman. I'm just as far as the people.
Well,
I
knew Terry, and I mean, Terry was the MC at the meeting place, and so I always knew him, and for a long time, and when the association came along, I mean, it was obvious. I mean, one of the things that I'm going to bring up one more time is that in those days, if you were playing in folk clubs or if you were playing around, you pretty much knew other people that were doing that, because you knew somebody in one of the other bands, or you would go to the Hootenanny Nights and you'd run into somebody. That guy's pretty good. Like at the meeting place, for instance. You know who Mike Seeger is, I'm assuming. Well, I was a big Mike Seeger fan, and Mike Seeger never came to the West Coast hardly. And if he did, he played at the Ash Grove sometimes. The New Lost City Ramblers were one of my biggest favorites, and most of the guys like Lindley and me and Ry Cooder and Taj, we were all these guys that were sort of into that scene, and we all kind of sort of came out of the Ash Grove and kind of came out and that music scene was pretty small and pretty tight, and there was the Troubadour, and there was the Ash Grove, and there was the Ice House, and there was a guy named Russ Jaguar. You know Russ?
No.
Russ was in the association. He was another member of the association. Well, he was the equivalent of what Terry was at the meeting place at the Ice House, and I knew Russ for years. He was the guy, you'd walk in and you'd always see him, and he was the guy that seated everybody, and he was sort of the guy that took the tickets and all that kind of stuff. So there were these guys that were around that were making a living, or that was part of their pay or whatever they were doing, and they all had these things going. And so then all of a sudden, along comes Mary and all that kind of stuff, and you see these guys on TV. All of a sudden, that's Terry Kirkman, and that's Russ Jaguar. And then you'd see there was a couple other guys in the association that were in other bands that I'd seen play. I knew who they were. They weren't necessarily friends of mine. There was a guy from Pomona in the band, and then I remember meeting Jim McGuinn, now Roger McGuinn, when before he was in the Byrds, and we were playing bluegrass. It was the summer of '64. It was the summer I got married, and we were playing the thing called the Pepsi Hootenanny. And we were on this little summer Southern California tour, and this guy, our fiddle player Richard Green, brought this guy to the gig, and he's a guy that had been playing with the Chad Mitchell Trio, and I'd been really. There's a guy named Paul Prestipino who was a multi-instrumentalist that had played with them, and this guy had taken their place, and I had never, and when he showed up, and he had Beatle boots on, and he had this weird hair, and he had those glasses, and none of us had even heard the Beatles yet. And he was talking about this scene in New York. I mean, in England, he'd just gotten back from New York, and obviously that's all of a sudden he was wearing the pants and the clothes, and he had the hair, and he was all and Chris Hillman, who was of course the bass player in the Byrds, was a bluegrass mandolin player, and he and I were exactly the same age, and both mandolin players, and both named Chris, and we used to even get them a station making for each other. They could look kind of like in those days, and so San Diego, and the guys that took our place at Disneyland was Chris Hillman's band, the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers. So after a while, you start knowing who these people are, and then especially during that time when all of a sudden this was a very active time when like I said, the power shifted, and when the hippie movement and the psychedelic movement and everything moved, it was all about California. And it was especially about San Francisco and LSD and pot, and like when I was in high school, nobody smoked pot. We all drank beer and smoked cigarettes, and if you ever had something else, you maybe had a rum and coke. But so it was. So we were the guys my age were like pre-hippies kind of. I mean, even though I was 18 in 19 '62. Most of the guys that kind of came into the hippie movement were the next sort of 3 or 4 years younger than me, and a little bit younger, and then that all started. So there's this movement where all of a sudden the record companies on the East Coast that were the folk companies, Elektra, Folkways, and Vanguard, were all on the East Coast, and most of the guys my age that were playing folk music were all at record deals. West Coast didn't have any.
Right.
I mean, Kingston Trio were on Capitol, but they were really, really commercial. Some of those guys, but none of us guys that were playing bluegrass and stuff had any, and we were good enough. But most of when most of us couldn't go to the East Coast when couldn't afford to go back there and that kind of stuff. So that was far away. So when the shift happened, all of a sudden, all of us guys that had played bluegrass and folk music all shifted to putting together our own electric bands, and so that's how people like the Grateful Dead. I mean, Jerry Garcia was a banjo player, and the guys in the Jefferson Airplane were folk musicians, and guys in the Charlatans and all this kind of stuff. So Moby Grape, Peter Lewis, folk guy. That's Loretta Young's son, and David Lindley's cousin, and I mean, it was all these different people. So the shift to the West Coast in the '60s. So Frank was a little bit ahead of the curve because he was already playing electric music, and the doo-wop stuff that he did with that was stuff that was I listened to on the radio because I was into Art LeBeau and I was into Hunter Hancock and a lot of that kind of stuff. So even though I was playing bluegrass, the music I was listening to was a lot of and I grew up in an half Mexican neighborhood. My best friend was a Mexican guy, so. I saw Richie Valens a month before. I'm being interviewed by a guy that's doing a book on Richie Valens the next week, and nobody saw Richie, and I was like in 9th grade, and I had some very vivid memories of seeing him, and so there was this weird kind of stuff that was going out here on the West Coast that finally took shape, and '64 on, all of a sudden, like I said, I was driving down the highway with my wife and my old '58 Volkswagen, and turned on the radio, and I heard, "I can't hide, I can't hide, I can't hide," and all of a sudden, oh, I bet you that's the Beatles. And I said, oh, I get it. It's Buddy Holly, it's Everly Brothers. I just went down the line. It hit me within 2 seconds, and that changed a lot of us because we found a music. A type of music that we could wrap ourselves around that was personal. Like most of the bluegrass stuff, we were doing traditional songs, and we were old time, and so we were doing other people's songs, and we were doing that kind of stuff, and this opened up a whole time where people were writing their own stuff and everything, and that's when I started writing. That's why I'm considered a singer-songwriter, and I've got 3 publishing companies and all that kind of stuff. So that was a very important time, that changeover period here, and I think that what happened on the West Coast, I've been interviewed for a couple of books recently, and it was like, I'll be 69 next birthday, and that's a long time ago now. And you start realizing, I was talking to my niece last night, and I started bringing up some people. Do you know about who this is? No. And those are all people that were big time in that time. So it was like me talking to my dad about growing up, who's still alive now. My dad was a clarinet player and sax player, and listened to jazz and saw Benny Goodman and Ellington and all those kind of places when he was young. And because I grew up with that stuff, I know who those people are. But a lot of people, nowadays have going back to the '60s. Who?
Right.
Oh, really? And so I played a lot of stuff. My niece and who's 33, and her husband came by last night, and they're knowledgeable people. And my sister's, a musician and played music around the house, and her former husband is a musician and played music around. All my son was in early Guns N' Roses and played in a group called the Decadents, which is a punk band that was a real significant punk band in the L.A. during when he was 13, 14 years old, and then a band called the Super Heroines, which was very, very well known for early metal band. He's got a group called Sonic Medusa that's playing around L.A. and he's 49 years old next birthday, and so in our family the music goes around and round and round, but it's like I said, that particular time now has historical. And guys like you doing this is a very important thing, because what it's doing is it's keeping the history alive, and that's why I like doing these things for for different people, because I think it's really important to. If somebody doesn't do it, then it gets lost, and it's amazing how fast it can get lost if somebody doesn't take care of this and put it on the table. So it's pretty much what I got to say.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Is that enough for you?
Wonderful. I think so. Oh yeah, plenty.
Oh, okay, good.
I do appreciate that.